Hello and welcome to another edition of the Tahsil Commons podcast. Joining us today is Professor Beverley Clack to discuss her book, How to Be a Failure and Still Live Well, a Philosophy. A brief introduction to Professor Clack. She is a professor in the philosophy of religion at Oxford Brookes University. Her publications include Interrogating the Neoliberal Lifecycle, The Limits of Success, Philosophy of Religion, A Critical Introduction, Freud on the Couch, Feminist Philosophy of Religion, Critical Readings, Sex and Death, A Reappraisal of Human Mortality, and Misogyny in the Western Philosophical Tradition. From 2012 to 16, she was city councillor for St. Clement's Ward in Oxford, and from 16 to 18, she was a member of the Labour Party's National Policy Forum. She is a member of the Methodist Church's Faith and Order Committee and a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. Professor Clack, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for asking me.
Thank you. You might have seen the email that I had sent you. We have a certain outline that we can try to address. At the outset, Professor Clack, how would you say, how do you define failure and how do you define loss? And what is the relationship between these two things? Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Let's just say, would it be helpful for me to just say something about why I wanted to write the book?
Of course, yeah, definitely.
Just to kind of give it a kind of context.
Of course, yeah.
One of the things that I think often happens with academic writing is you feel you have to write certain things because they're themes that are kind of, I don't know, trendy or cutting edge or something like that. And this book was actually a very personal book in many ways because I felt that there were themes and issues in my own life that I really wanted to address through the writing, which was quite scary in some ways because I don't think academics particularly like putting themselves on the page. But I was really interested in the kind of way in which when we experience failure, perhaps professional failures, perhaps personal failures, they can often seem overwhelming and really knock at our sense of self. So in the book, I detailed two of these. One was not being able to have children, which was a very upsetting experience and kind of raised questions about what it meant to be a success as a woman. And then there was a kind of professional failure around failing to write a book. And both of these things kind of really challenged me about what my life was about. And I really wanted to write something that was around these themes because the theme that I kept coming back to was the way in which this wasn't just a personal issue for me, but that we have a model of success, particularly in the Western world, that encourages us to think that the only way in which we can live well is through our achievements. And I really wanted to sort of think about that and challenge that because it seemed to me that that was something that was making not just myself unhappy, actually, it was making an awful lot of people unhappy. And so that kind of sets, I suppose, the frame of the book, really. And I think in some ways it's quite useful to know that because I think often academics try to hide exactly why it is that we're writing particular kinds of things. And often it's because they are coming out of a personal place, really.
I think that can be said in general about philosophy in general, that modern Western philosophy has been written in a kind of this disembodied, disembedded kind of way, where your context and the way you're coming from and your gender and your corporal reality is not really taken into consideration.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's exactly right. And I think there's an idea that somehow to enter into that is to perhaps muddy the waters a bit of your argument. And it should be something that's somehow detached from what it is to be a living human being. And I think in the book, that was what I really wanted to challenge, was that actually it's really important for us to think about what it's like to live in a world like this, which isn't set up with human desires in mind, actually, which isn't to say that it isn't a beautiful place that we can live well in. Yeah. It's just that I think we have a tendency to assume everything should be bent to our will. And sometimes it seems to me that philosophy kind of emulates that by suggesting a model of what it is to be human that is far more in control than we actually are. And I don't think that's very helpful.
Certainly, these are some themes which I would like to explore with you a bit more. particularly the way in which the modern subject is formed and the neoliberal subject, and which was also deriving from these Enlightenment ideals of an autonomous, rational, free agent. How is this different, and what has changed since the past? And particularly, I suppose in the first instance, I suppose we should look at how is failure constructed in our world, the discourse of failure and success, the discourse of
I think that's a very
yeah.
I think that's an extremely good point. And one of the things that I think initially I wanted to set out to do was to make a distinction between failure and loss, because they seemed to be run together in a lot of experiences. So I suppose when we think about failure, we're probably thinking about the opposite to success, and also the personal responsibility for failure. So there's something about responsibility, and indeed that might be personal, it might be political, it might be social, but there's very much that idea of responsibility. With loss, it seemed to me there's more about a fundamental aspect of the universe, that yes, we develop, we grow, but then we also decline and we encounter illness, dying, death. And that to me was about loss, I suppose, broadly speaking. But that what I found fascinated me about the kind of understanding of the self that's very dominant in our world is that those ideas of failure and loss get run together, so that things that actually are just part and parcel of life, like dying, like sickness, like death itself, actually come to be seen as forms of failure. You should have been able to control your health more effectively. You win or you lose your battle with cancer. And everything seemed to be set up around actually a notion of personal responsibility. And when I started digging into that idea, a colleague of mine alerted me to this sort of body of literature around the idea of neoliberalism, as this idea taken and developed from the Enlightenment, that we are fundamentally rational, responsible, independent, and that those features then get taken up in this kind of modern iteration of the notion of liberalism, where it gets linked to a very specific form of economics that places the individual at the heart as a kind of entrepreneurial self. You're the person who's going to make something of your life, and that's going to be understood through financial rewards, financial success, and that's actually the only way in which we can experience self-realization. And so that for me became a very important way into some of the narratives that are out there. And as I say, it's kind of a Western model, but it seems to me that it's been transported across the world, really. Yeah. That this idea of how to be a success through our achievements, particularly our financial achievements, has become incredibly dominant across the world, actually. I don't know, I'd be interested to know what you think about that, actually. Would you agree with that it's something that isn't just about what's happening in what we might call the Western world, but is actually something that's happening elsewhere too?
Certainly, I feel that's very much true. I suppose this has to do with the sense in which the West is still culturally, the Western discourse is culturally dominant throughout the world in terms of, and also because of its connection with capitalism and the way these things work. And I suppose it's also not so easy nowadays to demarcate between the East and the West. There isn't any pure East, even in the East itself. There isn't perhaps even a pure West. And this is our global condition in that sense.
Absolutely. One of the things that I did feel as I was writing the book, and this was my own perhaps sense of unease perhaps about some of the claims I make in it, is that it was, as I say, it was very much driven by personal concerns. And that really, I think, manifested itself in a desire to kind of reflect upon the culture in which I'm based, really, and the place in which I'm based. And so in that sense, I felt that there were aspects of it that I would have liked to have developed perhaps differently, and perhaps will do in future work, actually, which is much more around some of those perhaps differences and similarities elsewhere, actually, to get more of a kind of fleshed out sense, particularly the notion of what it is to be human that I kind of want to develop, which I think we'll go on to a little bit later. But it did feel to me that it was important in this book for me to kind of reflect a bit on the experience of living in the society that I live in, and particularly in terms of what that meant for individuals, but also what it means for our politics. And that, I think, as you pointed out in your very nice opening remarks, having been involved in practical politics, I was really interested in how that was made manifest in social policy in the UK. And so I think there is quite an emphasis on that, really.
Of course. Can we perhaps explore a little bit the idea of the construction of failure in Homo economicus, and what are the factors that lead to this particular construction of failure?
Yeah, I mean, I got very interested in the kind of way in which in the 1970s, a kind of series of crises effectively challenge some of the ways in which accounts of the state had developed in the post-Second World War period, particularly around that idea that the state was something that could intervene to improve people's lives, and that a series of kind of political crises and a sense perhaps of stagnation ended up leading to this, I suppose, grounding of society and economics around the individual. And in some ways you can see why that might have been seen as liberating, because I think if you're being told all the time that you are part of this bigger whole and you can be managed and manipulated, I suppose, by the state, then the idea that you are actually somebody whose individual desires and concerns and desire for flourishing, perhaps, is kind of not really being taken seriously through that model of an interventionist state. It seemed to me that, you know, that idea was quite attractive in some ways, but that it had this unfortunate side effect, which was that it emphasized an awful lot personal responsibility without really thinking about the way in which we're all shaped by the world around us, that it isn't as easy as saying you are in control of your life, which initially sounds great. And I think the idea that we have responsibility for ourselves sounds wonderful, you know, that you are somebody who can make of yourself what you will. It sounds quite fantastic, and you can see why people would want to embrace it. But the downside of that was that there seemed to me to be a failure to then understand some of these bigger economic movements and shifts, particularly in the structure of work, that then had a real effect on people, particularly people who are working in lower economic groups, who perhaps have less access to things like education or some of these methods for enabling you to develop yourself, to improve yourself. I mean, I write in the book quite a lot about my father's experience, because that to me was quite a useful way into this, as somebody who'd experienced a very settled job in a quite a thriving industry at one point, which was the blanket industry in Oxfordshire, very ancient, historic industry, who in the sort of late 70s, early 80s started to experience periods of unemployment as that model of a secure job broke down. And as somebody who hadn't had a formal education, he left school at 14, it meant that it was much more difficult for him to find the kind of fulfilling work that was being lauded as, you know, the kind of thing that you should aspire to as an aspiring individual. And I was just much more aware, I think, by reflecting on that, of how these bigger shifts in the way in which we organise industry or think about the economy actually had quite a massive impact on people who were at, I mean, for want of a better term, at the bottom end of these kind of economic models. So I think that notion of failure then became really important and significant for me, because of the way in which it so easily, as a model of the successful life, ended up telling people that they were failures if they didn't have certain material goods or certain forms of education, that somehow their lives were less significant, less important. Just as an aside on that, when the book came out, my dad, who's probably not entirely sure that he knows what I do, I don't think, when it came out, he loved the title and he loved the cover. But he said to me, and I found this so sad, he said to me, I must read this book because I think I'm a failure. And my dad is this incredible person who's done lots of youth work and has been very involved in his home church and has this very rich life, I think. But because of the way in which things are set up to promote a narrative of what it is to be successful, he at 86 was thinking of himself as a failure. And I found that really heartrending. So there's something about, I think, that model that ends up putting, I think, a pretty appalling weight on people and makes us undervalue some of the important things that we can do when we live in relation to other people, actually.
Yeah.
Is that helpful? Sorry, I've realised that I've covered quite a lot there.
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot of really interesting points to talk about. I feel I must also mention that reading your book is not only a brilliant experience in terms of the ideas it contains, but also a very moving experience at many places in terms of the emotions and the feeling. Yeah. And the discussion about failure and loss that is there in your book is not merely an abstract discussion. It is something deeply existential in that sense.
I think that's absolutely right. And it just strikes me again, I think this is something to do with my own dissatisfaction with certain models of philosophy, is that they don't particularly seem to want to engage with the existential. You know, there's kind of great sort of themes about what is it like to be a human being? What are the questions that we ask, just that come out of our everyday existence, really? And I kind of wanted to write it in a way that was much more about those experiences, and rather than dodging those, to actually try and write about them in a way that gets at some of the pain, actually, as well as the joy that there is in life. Because I think that's the other thing in the book. I didn't want it to be a miserable book, because I actually think reflecting on failure and loss actually enable us to have a kind of more well, I suppose a richer understanding of our lives, because you can't avoid either. But I really wanted to write it in a way that perhaps people could kind of come into the writing through then engaging with their own experiences of these things, because frankly, everybody experiences them in one way or another. So you know, it was at times I was slightly scared, if I'm really honest, because there are places in the book where I feel I've kind of put myself on the line in a way I haven't done in previous writing, and I still feel slightly nervous about that, because it is quite exposing. But I felt that those themes needed that, because otherwise they kind of lose their force.
You mentioned an important point, that the entire discourse or narrative about failure and success in economic terms, and of course the market, the free market ideology, it pretends as if everyone can be whatever they want, everyone can do whatever they want. You can be whatever you want in this society, in this economy, but I mean, you have the freedom. The autonomous free individual is prized, but what is not taken into consideration is, of course, as you mentioned, those who cannot afford it, who cannot afford to do whatever they want for financial reasons, for monetary reasons, as well as reasons of structural inequality.
Yes, absolutely.
This is the
I mean, I think that's such a good point.
Sorry.
Sorry, do carry on. So I was just going to say, I think that's such an important point that you raise.
Yeah. Which is also why.
Do you want to say a bit more?
Yeah, I was saying that, which is also why, as you mentioned, the political dimension of this discussion is important, because we're not only dealing with individuals, but these are structural and political injustices and inequalities. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think that that aspect to me is so important. That I don't know if the narrative has been the same in India, but here, one of the concepts that gets used quite a lot politically, less so it has to be said recently, but probably up till the pandemic struck, actually. I think pandemics changed things quite a lot. We might want to talk about that, actually. But the word that got used a lot politically across the political piece, so right and left, was this notion of opportunity. And the idea of creating a level playing field for people, so that once you do that, then a kind of meritocracy would develop, where if you were talented enough, you'd succeed. If you weren't, you wouldn't. And I think the problem with that kind of language was that in some ways it was quite naive about the strength of some of these structural inequalities, be they around class, race, sex and gender, that it's not as easy as saying, well, we've created this level playing field, now off you go. And I think that language became quite pernicious, because it became a way of writing off those people who failed to grasp these opportunities that were out there. And as a result, they could quite easily be condemned to pretty unpleasant lives, actually. So I think, again, another aspect of the book for me was trying to marry some of that stuff around personal failure and personal loss, and then also some of these bigger political and social constructions of these things, because the individual is never just an individual. They're always framed by the society in which they find themselves. And I thought that that was a really important thing to engage with, because it struck me that this language of success didn't want to really engage with those things. It particularly didn't want to engage with the iniquities that come with economic disadvantage. And that there didn't seem to be this desire to address that actually things aren't fair, that some people have more money, better connections, I'm going to say better in inverted commas forms of education, because I'm not entirely convinced that that's the case, but that they were able to kind of utilise these things in a way that a lot of people weren't. And it struck me that if you didn't take into account some of those structural inequalities, then you were never really going to be able to engage with the fact that there were a lot of political choices that lie behind understandings of what constitutes success and failure.
This also connects with the sense of responsibility, and of course with responsibility, the concomitant feelings of guilt if you're unable to perform, or if you're unable to meet your own expectations, particularly in this ideology of where everything is possible, you can do anything.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. Which of course isn't true, is it? I mean, you know, when I was younger, I wanted to be an actress. I would have been useless. I don't have the capacity. I can't, I just don't have it. I mean, possibly, I might have been a ballet dancer. I couldn't have done that. But, so holding out all of these sort of ideas that you can be whatever you want to be, actually you can't. And I think there has to be a certain type of realism around it as well, and I suppose this is where everything becomes quite binary, doesn't it? It's almost like if you say you can be anything you want to be, and then you can say, well, actually, perhaps there's some things you can't. Perhaps actually it's more about how do we find out what we're able to do and what we're not able to do, and actually to recognise that there's something quite important about that, rather than feeling that we have to fit in with one particular model of what it is to be successful, what it is to pursue our dreams. And I think sometimes the weight of those expectations of what life should be like can be quite overwhelming for people.
Yeah, I mean, this is all really interesting, and I must say that your book actually central to your discussion is the neoliberal subject, and we spoke about it, and what you almost trace the genealogy of the neoliberal subject in certain matters. We spoke about it in terms of work and in terms of the new capitalism. And there are a few more things particularly about death, for example, which I think we can look at. And how is death and sickness constructed in this neoliberal discourse?
Well, this is something I became really fascinated by, partly because there are a couple of memoirs that are written by Kate, get her name right, Kate Gross, and I've lost his name now. Sorry.
Yes.
It's lovely, Philip Gould, who were both kind of very central to what we call in the UK the New Labour project, which was very much this attempt to make the Labour Party electable, actually, let's be honest, and that it was very much focused around the shift from thinking about some of these big collective identities that might have been forged through union membership or the sense of some kind of class struggle, really, into this much more individualistic framing of a social democratic message. I have to say, I've got a lot of time for the things that the Labour government of the kind of, what was it, late 1990s into the noughties kind of changed. You know, I think they did some very good things. And frankly, I mean, not wanting to get too political here, I'm not very keen on our current government, if I'm really honest. But one of the things that I thought was interesting with these two memoirs, which were about Gross and Gould facing their own deaths because they both have diagnoses of cancer. One of the things that I found kind of fascinated me with these often very moving memoirs that they write was that the language of the neoliberal subject as this controlling, independent, autonomous thing just didn't really fit very well when encountering terminal illness and dying and death, because I think there's at one point, I think it's Gross uses this phrase. She says something like, I'm a woman who's used to being in control, and I've realised now that I can't game the outcome of this. So there's not actually a way that I can take this situation, which isn't very good, and kind of turn it to my advantage, because it's not that kind of thing. I'm not in control anymore. And there's a lot of anger in Kate Gross's book that I really liked, because for me, it got at this problem that we've got, that as soon as we focus too much on independence, autonomy, control, when we're actually in situations where we are living at what Arthur Frank calls at the will of the body, then suddenly all these mechanisms that we've had about our lives and how to live them suddenly start falling away. And it just struck me that here was a really clear example of how a model of what it is to be human was actually failing us as human beings, because it was encouraging a way of thinking about our lives that just wasn't realistic in any sense. And that there had to be a better way of engaging with what it is to be human that would open up the possibility of being able to accept that at times in our lives we will be vulnerable, dependent, and actually not in control of the things that happen to us. And that seemed to me a much healthier way of proceeding. I'd be interested to know what your reflections on that section are, because I thought, I mean, that's you know, because all that stuff around kind of how people approach mortality, really, in some ways, quite vital for blowing open this model. And I was just curious as to what you think.
It's really interesting that you ask that, because this genre of writing is something I've come to. I mean, I've acquired a fondness of, and I really like this kind of writing where people are confronting their own mortality, or they've been diagnosed with a terminal illness, uh, and they tend to be really insightful. And in many cases, I don't know. I mean, some of the books that I've read, they also tend to be a little bit theological, perhaps unwittingly. I mean, for example, the famous one is by Paul Kalanithi, When Breath Becomes Air.
Okay.
The physician by Paul Kalanithi.
Right.
And it's interesting because he wasn't a religious person in that sense, but he, at the end, I mean, what I've noticed is that in such situations where one is confronted by such a serious limitation to one's own capacities, you realize this kind of this great beyond, I mean, this great transcendence, or this great, I mean, you realize your own incapacities. And even a person like Oliver Sacks, for example, the neuroscientist, who was an atheist for all practical purposes, nonetheless, even in his memoir, he says that at such moments he feels only something such as the Bible or some other, or some works of poetry can actually meet the seriousness of the situation. Any other reading at that point doesn't seem to cut it for him. And this is something I found really deep, really profound. Yeah.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think what I found interesting, again, with the trajectory of the Philip Gould book, is that at the end, you get this sense that it is kind of some kind of religious framing that makes more sense for him. I think he says at one point, I've become more kind of, I don't know if he says incoherently religious, but it's almost like there's something else that's coming out of this. I mean, one of the things I found really sad with that, actually, was it struck me that perhaps we do a disservice when we frame religion so rigidly as you have to sign up to a set of dogmas, doctrines, and beliefs. Yeah. And that actually, in a way, means that people often think they're not engaging with religious things and religious questions, when in a way they are. And particularly that thing about, how do I orientate myself towards the universe? You know, how do I understand my short, tiny little life in this massive swathe of time and space? How am I going to make sense of that? And that, to me, is the fundamental question at the heart of religion. And it seems to me that most people ask that, and want to ask it, and have to ask it. Okay. And that perhaps when we become rigidly focused on what are the differences between the world and space, for example, that we sometimes lose that sense that human beings have that kind of desire, in some ways, to kind of engage with those questions about what my life means in this massive cosmos.
No, this really connects to this really fascinating discussion you have on religion as well, which is something we can turn to. But before that,
I mean, the other thing that I thought was very interesting. Sorry. Well, the thing that I thought was very interesting that you picked up on was this idea of sickness as memento mori.
Oh yes, yeah, definitely.
And I thought that was a very, again, that was something that I was kind of fascinated by, that, perhaps rather than think about periods when we're ill as being, I don't know, a waste of time or something that's, something to get over in a way, that perhaps if we actually reflect a little bit more on those, yes, they are kind of indications of the fact that we are fundamentally vulnerable and we do live at the will of the body, and that actually those things might, again, open up this reflection on the fact that we are mortal. So I think that, to me, is, again, it kind of challenges that idea that when we think about what it is to be human, we're always supposed to be talking about autonomy or freedom or independence or control, that these are all kind of quite strong, powerful representations of what it is to be human. Now, of course, this is an aspect of what it is to be a human being, but it just seems to me that if we ignore those other things, things like sickness and frailty and vulnerability and all of those things, and dependence, actually, which I think is a really important one, that we are dependent upon others and the planet for our existence, that we somehow end up with a lopsided model of what it is to be human that's actually done great damage to our planet as well, because I think we assume that we will survive the death of the planet. But we won't.
Yeah.
So, it's a kind of a very curious kind of blind spot. So it just struck me that there's something about looking at illness that was actually really important.
This is really interesting because I don't think I mentioned this, but I'm also a doctor, a physician, and this aspect is really fascinating for me as well. And you might be familiar with this philosopher Harvey Carell, who writes on the phenomenology of illness. And particularly important, what I found really fascinating was she has one essay in which she talks about the importance. I mean, she writes about, in general, she writes about how philosophy can help us conceive of illness and the phenomenology of illness. But she also again then writes about how illness can help philosophy, how illness can open new vistas for philosophy, for philosophical thinking, and which is, I think, what you're also trying to get at, and which is also connected with the initial quote that you had in your in your room as a student by Paul Tillich, which I keep coming back to when I'm reading your book, because it seems to be really at the center of your book. This idea of the shaking of foundations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm really tempted to read that because it is kind of, I mean, I love this quote, and as you say, it was a quote that was kind of something that I came across first when I was an undergraduate studying theology, and it really spoke to me, particularly, what would I have been, 18, 19, and, having all of those kind of trials and tribulations that you have in your late teens going into your 20s, and that sort of sense that you were kind of trying to work out who you were. And it's a quote that I've come back to over the years, because I think we're always, in a way, trying to go beneath the surface of who we seem to be. So this is what Tillich says. It's only when the picture that we have of ourselves breaks down completely, only when we find ourselves acting against all the expectations we had derived from that picture, and only when an earthquake shakes and disrupts the surface of our self-knowledge, that we're willing to look into a deeper level of our being. Still love it. It still gives me the chills, because it's that idea that when we have these experiences that seem to throw us off kilter, that kind of make us feel like, how am I going to cope with this? How am I going to engage with this? What does it mean to be me? Why did I act like this? Why did this happen? All of those questions, rather than see them as problems to be overcome, they're actually the method by which we can get into a deeper understanding of who we are. And it's still, to me, I still love that quote. I still love Tillich's writing. I think he is somebody who understands that process of how we develop a deeper engagement with our life, and that things like failure and loss, actually, and grief, and all of those things are actually in some ways better ways of enabling us to do that. Because when things are going well, there's a tendency to skirt across the surface of life. We don't need to grapple with those things. We don't need to question ourselves. We don't need to challenge ourselves about who we are and why we're living in the way that we are. But when we are knocked, when we have these kind of blows, perhaps blows to the ego might be a good way of putting it, when we think we know what we are, we think we know how we're going to act, and then something happens and we don't do any of those things, or we feel completely at a loss, it's then that we have this opportunity, in a way, to reflect again, to think again. And I think the other thing that I always like with Tillich is that for him is the thing that makes you a philosopher, that makes you a thinker, that makes you somebody who's prepared to engage with the depths. And so there's another part, I won't try and find it now because it'll take me too long, where he talks about the student who knows the contents of 100 books and still is living on this surface level. And then somebody who does a very menial job, who one day asks the question, why am I doing this? Why am I living in this way? Should I be living like this? For him, they are the person who's on the way to depth. And I think that became, again, for me, quite an important point here, because it reorientates philosophy, I think, back to an engagement with wisdom and what wisdom means, rather than a focus on knowledge. And I'm not saying knowledge isn't important, because it is. Heavens, my job is dependent upon me instilling the knowledge of philosophical terms and religious terms in my students. But it's that wisdom, that attempt to kind of understand how we might live better. What does it mean to be alive? How to reflect on this wonderful passing experience of being alive, that I feel sometimes philosophy, professional philosophy, doesn't really want to engage with. It doesn't want to think about wisdom. That seems a bit hokey. You know, is this something for, you know, I don't know, self-help books or something like that, rather than philosophical terms. Yeah. But it seems to me Tillich's very good at getting us to think about what does it mean to think, and what does it mean to be a philosopher, actually. So thank you for alerting me to that one, because I love that quote. That's, I think, very good.
Yeah, certainly. And you make really good use of Tillich as well throughout the book, and particularly when talking about religion. I suppose we can look at Tillich's idea of faith, as you were mentioning, that we needn't conceive of religion as institutionally closed, or as I mean, I guess religious experience is not the monopoly of people, of religious believers, would be a better way to put it.
I think that's right. I mean, I think what I like about how he engages with some of these questions of religion is he opens up to this idea that actually religion is something that is common, or a religious engagement with the world is something that is common to all human beings. It's something fundamental to what it is to be human, because we are strange animals, basically, probably quite animals that are in some ways, I suppose, you know, not wishing to get too Nietzsche about it, but that we are kind of maladapted in some ways. You know, we have these strange social constructions that make us much more vulnerable than a lot of other animals, basically. So what is it? What is this thing that makes us human? I mean, I argue in the book that it's about the desire for connection, that's what makes us human, and that for me is fundamentally about religion. And I think, or at least that attempt to make a connection with the world outside yourself, be it in terms of another human being, but also more broadly, the connection you might try to make with the universe that you find yourself in. And I found Tillich very rich as a source, because of this way in which he challenges our assumptions, actually, about what constitutes religion. And I love his writing on faith and what it means to have faith, and his argument that all human beings have faith, which can sound quite shocking, I think, because we so often put this notion of faith in the category of religion and religious belief. And that his argument is that because of the kind of creatures we are, that we are creatures that are making connection with each other and the world outside ourselves, we all have to have some sort of faith in something. And the difference for him is about what makes your faith and the object of your faith worthy of that faith. And of course, he's a figure who's forged by the events of the Second World War, by the rise of fascism and totalitarianism more generally. And the idea that people will place their faith in all sorts of things, possibly things that are not worthy of their faith. And I suppose the most obvious thing would be charismatic leaders who promise the world, really. And again, what Tillich gets us to think about is whether these are appropriate locations for our faith. And this is where he introduces this idea of ultimate concern as well. What is our ultimate concern? What is it that shapes our engagement with the world? And that we, by asking those questions, I suppose, eventually will come to think about that which transcends some of these, transcends these concerns, actually. And that for him is being itself, which we can translate as God, or we can translate as existence, or I've been reading quite a lot of Albert Schweitzer recently, and his idea of the reverence for life, and that life that flows through our veins also connects us with the rest of the living world. You know, you could have all of these things, but for him, it's this idea that faith isn't something that's just for the religious in this very narrow definition of what it is to be religious. It's rather that all of us have this. We're all trying to make sense of our place in the world, and we're looking for things to put our faith, put our trust in. And what goes wrong, I suppose, when we put that faith in the wrong things, or the things that are ultimately destined to disappoint, to not live up to the faith that we've placed in them. So I kind of like the fact that he opens up this different understanding of what constitutes the religious. And again, I think the thing I wanted to do with that is that as somebody who's written on philosophy of religion for a long time, I kind of wanted to get at this idea that there is something about the religious that needn't be understood in this very narrow, rigid sense of, well, what are the belief systems of different world traditions? I wanted to get more at the fact that human beings have a kind of religiosity about them because of this desire to make connection outside the self, with others, with the world, with something that transcends possibly the world. So, you know, it was that I really wanted to get at. And I think Tillich was extremely helpful for that move.
I think this connects back to what we were discussing previously about the shaking of the foundations, and particularly those kind of experiences where you face your limits and the limits of your capacities and of who you thought you were. You are confronted with the beyond, or the transcendent, or this thing which just doesn't submit to your thinking or how you want things to be.
And I think he's very good as well at saying that often the religious are the worst for recognizing that. You know, there's you know, in some ways a lot of religious practice can feel like it's telling the divine to, you know, sort out your life, or, you know, trying to make bargains with the divine through ritual practice or something like that. And again, I kind of like in there this sense that he's challenging and disrupting that model. So in a way, I think actually sometimes religious people can be the worst offenders for being precisely constrained by this model that assumes that life will always go the way you want it to go, and that there is a deeper way of engaging with life that can come out of recognizing the value and importance of things like failure and loss, actually. Yeah.
I was actually also getting at, I mean, this is also an interesting connection that I think we can see, that perhaps it is because, I mean, it is perhaps these experiences of reaching your limits, of the foundations being shaken, is these experiences that are more amenable to a kind of theological or religious inclination or openings. You introduced the idea of homo religiosus when talking about uncertainty, embracing uncertainty, and for you, it seems to me the experience of religion or being a religious being best best captures the attitude with uncertainty that is the ideal. I don't know if I'm making sense. This is
Yeah, you are completely. I mean, I think it's one of the things that I again kind of wanted to sort of do was in disrupting this economic model of the self, where you are supposed to be in charge of things, you're going to achieve success, and that success is going to be through your achievements, particularly wealth, all of those material possessions. That it's a very hard model to disrupt, because I think, as I was saying at the beginning, there's something very attractive initially about this idea that you are in control of your life and your destiny. I think we all like that idea. And I think the thing that I really like with religious narratives is there's always this kind of more realistic, it seems to me, perhaps often rather than always, but often this kind of more realistic engagement with life. I mean, I'm a practicing Christian, and one of the things that I like in Christianity is the narrative of the 3 days of Easter, that you have the failure of the crucifixion, the disappointment of Holy Saturday, when Christ is in the grave and his disciples are like, what the hell was all this about? And then the resurrection on Easter Sunday. Now, I'm not saying you have to accept any of these things, but I think the story itself is interesting, that you have this sense that rather than avoid failure, rather than avoid disappointment, you have this kind of structure where it's saying, well, actually, this is fundamental to the way things are, the way life is, that you will experience these things, and it's whether you can come to some kind of new life out of these things. And it's a new life that is orientated to something that transcends your own desires, your own preferences. And I kind of like the idea that there are in these religious stories this ability to disrupt some of the things that we think God or the divine, or however we want to frame that, should be doing. And that instead it's more about a reorientation of the self to this broader universe. And that it can be very fulfilling, it seems to me, to give up on some of those models that would make us assume that life should go in a particular way, because of the fact it won't. And that the joy of religious narratives, it always seems to me, is that they give us the materials to engage with these things and to enable that reorientation. I was very interested on your notes where you make a comment about a Rumi reference.
Oh, yes.
Please tell me more, because that sounded really fascinating.
Of course. Yeah, well, I mean, I couldn't, especially going through the discussion about religion, I couldn't help but process some of these things through an Islamic lens.
Yeah, absolutely.
Through some of Islamic thinkers and philosophers. A couple of points about this. For example, you also mentioned St. Augustine's quote, "Thou hast formed us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they find rest in thee," which is also perhaps the idea of Tillich's idea of the only the ultimate can fill that void or that desire. The penultimate cannot do that for you. Well, I was mentioning that the very idea of creation in Islamic cosmology, the word for creation etymologically comes from the word for separation. So creation is seen as a separation from the source, and so this is where I was thinking about Rumi. You might remember I've got his Masnavi over here, the first volume of his Masnavi, and these are the very first lines. Rumi speaks of the reed flute. The sound of the flute sounds like a lament, and it's let me just read it over here. Now listen to this reed flute's deep lament about the heartache being apart has meant. Since from the reed bed they uprooted me, my songs expressed each human's agony. A breast which separations split in two is what I seek to share this pain with you. When kept from the true origin, all yearn for union on the day they can return.
Wow, that's fantastic.
So this is where
And
I was
how?
thinking about for me.
Well, I mean, as you say, I mean, the echoes with Augustine and the heart being restless until it finds its heart, its place in you. I mean, this is why I think there is something here to be kind of mined, perhaps, for an understanding of the kind of religious impulse, perhaps, for want of a better term, that seems to me a much more positive way of thinking about the religious traditions we have in the world, you know, that rather than being in a battle of ideas, or, you know, that there's something there that's speaking to this longing, this desire to connect with that which is outside the self. And that I think this is where I suppose, again, it's kind of my general sense that the sort of focus on individualism hasn't been very helpful for this, because of the fact that we are encouraged to think of ourselves as radically separate from each other. And I think that lends itself to this idea that somehow we should be able to bend the world to our will, rather than trying to make this deeper, in some ways quite poignant connection from the self to the world around us. I mean, my feeling at the moment is that, if anything, the context now might be more receptive for thinking again about what it is to be human, apart from some of these very individualistic, quite selfish ways of thinking about what it is to be human. Because I think the pandemic has taught us that we're all fundamentally dependent on each other. And what I think is quite sad at the moment is that the way in which the nations have gone about engaging with things like the vaccine, for example, it's kind of being driven by a lot of sort of nationalistic, I suppose, prioritising of what's good for us in a very narrow way, rather than seeing ourselves as fundamentally connected to each other. And that suffering in one place actually has an impact on us too. And I think one of the things here in the first lockdown that was really telling was how people were re-engaging with the people around them in quite different ways, actually, and who were seen as the key workers were quite different from the people who were usually seen as being the most important. You know, it was the people who stacked the shelves in the supermarket. It was the people who were doing care work, which is chronically underfunded here and underpaid. It was nursing staff. You know, it was all of these people who often get written off. And it just felt like there was something going on with the pandemic. And I think the problem at the moment, it seems to me, is we're again caught with this desperate desire for things to go back to normal, when perhaps we need to learn some of those very deep lessons about the connection that there is between each of us, actually, and also that we are in a world that isn't always going to be controllable by human beings, and that's the joy, the glory of it, and that we need to come up with better ways of living with that world, really, and with each other.
Yes. There's actually a personal experience of mine as well, which happened in the pandemic. Earlier this year, actually, my mother got diagnosed, and apparently the CT scans were really bad. The prognosis was really poor. So we got her admitted into the ICU, and it was a moment at which it really felt like we felt really helpless, and we felt like. I mean, no one is prepared for that. But I mean, my mother, she recovered completely. She's fine now.
Oh, I'm so pleased.
Yeah. But I guess that moment really shook me, I guess, as it should. And it was really pivotal for me as well in terms of my own outlook of life, and in terms of my own, I mean, even though I knew these ideas about the facile nature of the autonomous self, but these weren't internalized within me. I mean, when you are confronted with such an experience, you realize that any philosophy which doesn't help you in that experience, what good is it?
Yeah, completely agree. I think it is those experiences where we're confronted, as you say, with the limits of our control and our experience, actually, and how painful and difficult they are to engage with. You at least need to feel, don't you, that philosophy might offer some kind of way through it, some kind of way of engaging with it, rather than either ignoring it or just misrepresenting it, which seems to me a real problem. And I think it also, I don't know, I mean, I was thinking about this in relation to a friend of mine, well, actually two friends have recently died from various forms of cancer, and one had a short run into the diagnosis, so it was literally, I think, from start to finish about 4 weeks. And then a friend who died last week, an old school friend actually, had stomach cancer, and I was telling another friend about this, and her immediate response was to say, life's so cruel. And I don't think it's that. See, that's not quite because I think that's the case if we assume that life will follow a path where we all live to a ripe old age and we die in our beds. And, you know, that's not how it is. But I don't think that then leads us to think that life is cruel, because that's just a binary way of engaging with it. You know, it's either this or it's that. Whereas in practice, it always seems to me that life is at its richest when we're able to accept that we have loss and growth, we have failure and success, we have joy and sorrow. These are the things that are part and parcel of life, and that we have to find ways of being able to embrace them. Otherwise, we just end up, well, perhaps just depressed beyond anything, really. But I think because we're encouraged to think of things in this very linear way, we're not really given the tools to then engage with some of these things. And again, I think this is where, for me, religious narratives enable that, because they kind of open this up and they shape this up. And thank you for sharing that beautiful piece of Rumi poetry. That was just, lovely.
This reference was actually related to Paul Tillich's quote, where you talk about love is the power and the ground of everything, and just driving it toward reunion, and ultimately towards the ground itself, reunion with the ground itself, and this separation from the source and reunion to it. You actually reminded me of the kind of frustration at facing mortality or at facing sickness. Reminds me of Leo Tolstoy's Even Illich, the death of Even Illich.
Which is such a wonderful text, isn't it?
Of course.
Yeah. And I think it's still so relevant. So what he writes that at the end of the 19th century, but it just still resonates, that idea of how somebody who's never really thought about mortality will face their own end, actually, and the kind of the fears and the desire to push that to one side. And I think particularly the attitude of the friends around him, that they want it to be an accident that Ivan has brought upon himself by his sort of failure to live in an appropriate way, rather than see the fact that they too will one day die. But they're so scared of that knowledge that in the end it becomes easier to blame him. I mean, I think we've seen this, haven't we, in the pandemic, where the kind of narratives around people who've died, sometimes there's this idea of, well, what was the underlying health condition that they had, as though that somehow makes it their responsibility. And I think that's a way of defending ourselves from the fact that actually we are all open to that kind of vulnerability, actually. And we have to find some way of living with that, really. And again, for me, I just feel that those sort of religious narratives, because they have such a history and a depth to them of this sort of struggle, really, with what it is to be a human being, actually provide us a lot of the time with better resources for engaging with these things than some of these more upbeat and optimistic tones that would suggest you can, through an act of will, conquer illness or win the battle with cancer, or however it might be framed, you know? And it just seems to me that there's a depth in those traditions that sometimes gets lost in the way that they're set up in some forms of secular discourse. And it has to be said amongst the religious themselves, that sometimes it can seem as though they're offering a panacea for all of life's ills, when it's not really quite that.
This also reminds me of this wisdom in Ecclesiastes.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, neither yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to the men of understanding, but time and chance, happiness to them all.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, I love Ecclesiastes. I was thinking about that yesterday, actually, the a time to be born and a time to die passage in Ecclesiastes, where, again, that just seems so wise. And I'm thinking about, at the moment, we're sorting out wills and things like that. I think the pandemic has all made us all think a little bit more clearly about things like the end of life. And I was thinking about exactly Ecclesiastes, actually, that there's such a beauty in that acceptance that that's how it is. This is how life is. And I'm always reminded of, I think it's Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, who at one point says, you know, this is the terms on which we live life. You know, you come into the world and you go out of it. And if you don't like those terms, then, well, it's kind of tough, you know, that's just how it is. And I quite like that kind of realism that then makes us think a little bit about, well, how might we live best? And I do think, for me, it goes back to that thing of how do we connect ourselves more fully with this overarching universe, with this sense of something that transcends the self. Now, for religious people, it will be easy to find a way of labeling that. But I think it's more that idea of how do we connect to the transcendent, that which is beyond human desires and preferences. Because I think the problem we have is that we're encouraged to think that those desires and preferences are the most important thing and will always be met. And of course they won't. So I think there is something about that kind of realism in religious discourse that I quite like, if I'm honest.
There's also, of course, the element that what is hindering us or what makes us handicapped in dealing with these realities of life is also in some part the heritage of modern Western philosophy, and particularly because of its male-centric experience of the world, which is also something you touch upon quite profoundly in your book.
Yeah, I mean, there is a big section in the book on women failure. And again, I think it would, I mean, perhaps I don't know if we want to necessarily revisit a lot of that, but
certainly.
But I think there's definitely something about how that the kind of willingness, particularly to kind of accuse women of failing to meet up to certain models of what it is to be a successful woman. So be it beauty, be it reproduction, that in a way, focusing and reflecting on those might reveal some of the ways in which it's very easy to identify women as kind of the problem. It's their problem. Aging's their problem. Infertility's their problem. And so in a way defend the male self from those things. And I kind of felt that was quite an interesting way into it, that kind of reflected and kind of fitted quite nicely with some of the material on death, actually, and the avoidance of death. That, you know, these are things that happen to all of us, and that perhaps some of the weight that's been placed upon women is kind of bearing the weight of that kind of transient set of values, you know, valuing things like beauty, or which actually beauty and its transient nature is actually really significant and important, because that's part of what makes the world such a beautiful place. But when women are encouraged to look younger, or encouraged to see fertility as their, or infertility as their failure, actually, then I think it becomes a rather different thing. But I thought, again, that by thinking about women's experience of these things was quite a good way of opening up some of these questions about quite what it is to be a successful human being, actually.
The reason I mention this is because I don't know if you would agree with me that women are potentially more attuned to the corporal or the bodily dimension of human existence, which I guess was also why male philosophers tended. It was easier for them perhaps to dismiss those dimensions of existence in that sense.
Yeah, I think there's an aspect of truth in that, because I think from the point where a woman starts menstruating, you're always being reminded of the body. It's always there. It's not something you can easily shelve. Now, I know in a lot of contemporary feminist discourse, this isn't a particularly popular thing to say, for all sorts of good reasons, because I think often the nature of the female body has been seen as a means of using stereotypes that mean that, for example, women can't be philosophers because they're just, irrational and they're associated only with the body. But it does seem to me that there's something quite powerful there, that you are aware of the changing nature of human life in a very, in a very powerful kind of way. And that seems to me something that we shouldn't really ignore, that there is something there that's actually quite significant and important for thinking about the nature of change in human life. And as I say, it's not a particularly popular theme for a lot of feminists, I suspect, for the same sort of reasons we've been talking about, that actually we might prefer to think about models that emphasise a kind of transcendence from the body, because the body's quite, it's messy, it's prone to illness, it's all of these things, really. And I think to re-embrace the body, I think, is actually quite an important thing for feminists, it seems to me, because there's something quite powerful there that does kind of connect us in more with some of these natural movements of forces that are beyond us, actually.
Of course. Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, it's an entire topic in itself, and we best avoid getting too deep in that. Perhaps we could.
I think this is. That's the only thing I think in the book. Sometimes I feel that there are an awful lot of big topics there, but I kind of liked that. I liked the idea of just dealing with a lot of stuff, really, because people can find what they in the book, what they're going to find interesting, actually, and it's fascinating to hear the bits that have spoken to people, really.
So I suppose in conclusion, we could perhaps talk a little bit about some of these practices that you mentioned at the end.
Yeah, that's a very good idea. So I suppose I became interested in how we might sort of orientate ourselves more to the world, really. And I think I was at pains, I hope, to make it plain that this isn't an easy thing to do, that there is the problem of evil. There is the fact that some people experience way more suffering than others and will find it much more difficult in many ways to do some of these things. But it struck me that we all at some point have to at least try to do this. And so I was quite interested in the kind of practices that might enable us to do this. One of the things that comes out, I hope, quite strongly at the end of the book is this idea of walking, actually, that walking or being in the natural world might be something that enables us to sort of move beyond our own concerns and to reflect a little more through attending to the processes of the natural world, perhaps, and the beauty of the natural world sometimes. And that there's a kind of practice that can be shaped around those things that enables this deeper sort of reflection. I've recently been reading quite a lot of Annie Dillard, who writes a lot on the natural world. And one of the things that I think is quite good about her material, and I want to use some of this in future work, is that she's very cautious about making the natural world an obviously simply beautiful place. You know, she's very keen to say, well, actually, if we look at how insects reproduce, often that involves, you know, some pretty repellent practices when we start thinking about what this actually means, particularly parasitic kind of practices. But I kind of like that idea that there's something about walking or something about sitting in the natural world or just reflecting on it that challenges the centering of the self, of seeing everything through us and our concerns and our desires, and somehow engaging with the world outside ourselves, and particularly in the natural world. I think that can be very helpful. I mean, personally, I found this very helpful through the various lockdowns we've had in the UK. Just even walking around the local park became a place of attending to all the small changes that are happening in those universal cycles. And that I found very reassuring when so much was strange and difficult and up in the air. Being able to just focus on those things kind of put things in their proper place somehow. So those sort of practices I thought were quite helpful, partly as well because although, as I say, I am a practicing Christian, I didn't want to make this a book about, well, you know, I didn't want it to be a kind of, I'm not quite sure what the word is, apologetic text that was trying to get people to believe what I believe. I don't particularly want that. I wanted it to be more about how there are practices that enable people to reorientate the self, and some of us will find that through religious practice, but others might well find it through walking or sitting, looking out at the sky, or, you know, those kind of things. Now, in some ways, I think that might seem like a very small scale, perhaps almost disappointing ending to the book. You know, there isn't some kind of grand solution that I'm going to offer, because I don't think there is a grand solution. I think there are different ways of making that connection with the thing we've talked about, this kind of thing that transcends our desires and preferences. And I think sometimes the small scale can be as powerful as some of these bigger solutions. But I know when the book was initially read by one of the publisher's readers, they were a bit like, oh, is that really it? Go for a walk. Well, yeah, it kind of is, because unfortunately there aren't really any of these shortcuts, I don't think. I think it's just more about having to develop forms of practice where we are able to just kind of recognise that we aren't at the centre of things, that we can look outside the self, and that there might be very small things that we can do in order to do that.
Yeah. I suppose that perhaps might be part of the pathology, that we are seeking something grand, some grand solution to our problems.
Yeah,
and
yeah, I think
that is what is preventing us from recognizing the greatness of the everyday. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that notion of the everyday is so important, actually. It's those kind of quite undramatic in some ways, but reflections or things that you can pay attention to in the world outside yourself that might well be the thing that enables you to find a kind of accommodation to the different aspects of life, actually. And it's hard, it is quite hard. But it may be that there's this kind of simplicity to some of the things we could do, actually. But yeah, I think if people think they're going to buy the book and they're going to get a kind of grand answer that will solve all their problems, they're really not. It's perhaps more small scale. Yeah.
But at least they get a kind of this. I mean, if the book is successful, they become disillusioned by the kind of false ideas of these false idols and these delusions that that will eventually end up hurting us if we hold on to them for long.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's exactly what I wanted to do, was to destabilize some of those narratives that have such a strong hold on us that they can seem almost natural. You know, it's obviously the case that we should strive to be successful. It's obviously the case that having lots of money will be a panacea to life's ills. You know, to use Margaret Thatcher's phrase, you know, there is no alternative to the discourse that we've been given, but there always is an alternative. And I think by just thinking a little about what that alternative might be, we might well open up the possibility of having richer lives, more flourishing lives, lives that are actually strangely more fulfilling, precisely because we step out of that narrative that the only fulfilling life is the successful life. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's a good point to end on.
I think so too.
Yeah.
I enjoyed that extremely. Thank you so much for your careful reading of the book.